Here, to begin with, as the Master Shantideva has said, if with this life of leisures and endowments, which is so difficult to find, if I fail now to turn this to my profit, to use it for benefit, then how could I possibly find such a situation again? So right now we have this precious life with all of the kinds of freedoms or leisures and the endowments to be able to practice the Dharma. We have been born in a situation as a human, and not only as a human, but not in sort of like borderlands or sort of extreme isolated places where the Dharma hasn't arrived. We aren't in a situation where we don't have, say, all of our faculties to be able to practice the Dharma, or we aren't really embedded in wrong views that make it impossible for us to actually habituate us to the Dharma. So we have this kind of situation of freedom from those conditions where we are unable to practice. And it's also in the case that we have all of the kind of opportunities. Not only have we been born as a human, but we have the Buddha's teachings. So this eon is one in which the Buddha has come. Many eons, we call them dark eons, because the space of time in which there is becoming and abiding, destruction, and so forth, no Buddha comes, no Buddha teaches. But a Buddha has come to the world, and not only that, he taught the Dharma. And not only did he teach the Dharma, but the Dharma remains to this day. There are those that follow after it. We are able to have those teach us the Dharma and have friends help us to be able to practice. So right now we have all of the conducive conditions to be able to actually make progress in the Dharma. All the kind of external conditions or opportunities, as well as the kind of internal conditions. So we should recognize that this life that we have right now is extremely precious. And rather than letting it go to waste, we should make it profitable. We should use it in a meaningful way. So, as this verse says, this life of leisure and opportunity is extremely difficult to find. And the reason that it's so extremely difficult to come across is because we need to accumulate all of the proper causes in order to gain such a rebirth. So abandoning the 10 non-virtues and engaging in virtuous actions and so forth, we need to do these actions in a previous life in order to have all of the necessary causes for such a rebirth. And it's said that the causes are extremely rare to accumulate, and so therefore this kind of body is extremely rare. As the example that is given also in Shantideva of gaining a human rebirth is as common as, so if we have this huge vast ocean and this blind turtle who is coming up to the surface once every 100 years, and on the surface of this ocean there is a small wooden ring, the chance of that turtle putting its head through that ring is like the chance of us gaining this kind of rebirth in the future. And so recognizing how extremely rare this is, we then try to make meaningful the life that we have. And this begins by recognizing again that we have in previous lives accumulated the causes for such a rebirth. And so the first kind of stage of training, that of the being of small capacity, is recognizing that what makes this life meaningful is being able to accumulate the causes to attain such a good rebirth again in the future, a life as a human or a god. So making sure that we don't fall into the lower realms by practicing virtue and abandoning non-virtue. This is the kind of training for the being of small capacity. But then one moves on to thinking, well, even if I accumulate such virtue to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god, it's still in the nature of suffering. I'm still subject to the sufferings of samsara because it's taken under the control of karma and the afflictions. So whether that's a rebirth in the lower realms or whether a rebirth as a human or a god, it's still not a lasting, stable kind of freedom. So a being of middling capacity goes beyond the kind of good rebirth of a human or a god to wanting this kind of freedom, a stable, lasting happiness. But then one thinks, well, just to strive for my own liberation alone is not okay, because all of these sentient beings that have acted as my mother and father, they too are in this cycle of suffering. And so I want to be able to free them as well, bring them to a state of freedom. And for that sake, one needs to strive for the state of Buddhahood, a state in which one has abandoned all faults and gained all good qualities. Thereby one is able to work for the benefit of other sentient beings. So slowly over time, lifetime after lifetime, one will accumulate these kinds of qualities, develop these qualities and abandon one fault until one gets to that state of Buddhahood, where one is effortlessly able to work for the welfare of other sentient beings. So that's the kind of contemplation of the being of great capacity. So again, when we have this precious human rebirth, we should, while we have this opportunity, use it for our benefit, make it meaningful in terms of gaining a good rebirth in the future, striving for liberation or striving for that state of Buddhahood. And in order to do so, abandoning our attachment and hatred, engaging in the practice of virtue, meditating on love and compassion and bodhicitta. If one fails to do that right now, then what will one have in the future? How will one gain such a state again? So here, this life, which is so difficult to find, we should right now take advantage of it by making it meaningful, by training our mind in the trainings of the being of small capacity, middling capacity, and great capacity, thinking that I will, by whatever means, strive for the state of Buddhahood to be able to benefit all sentient beings. And for that purpose, I am now going to listen to the Dharma. So in that way, we should set such a motivation for listening to the teachings. So here in the text, then, we have gone through the kind of scope of the being of small capacity, and then that of the being of middling capacity, thinking about the various sufferings of samsara and wanting to get out of that. And then we moved on to thinking about the kind of contemplations of a being of great capacity, including meditating on love and compassion and so forth, particularly through this it's sometimes called sixfold cause and then the one effect, or sevenfold cause and effect method. So here I wanted to take some time to actually discuss the kind of method of equalizing and exchanging self and other that doesn't come here in this text, but is explained more clearly in the Shantideva's text. So when we are doing this generation of bodhicitta based upon the sevenfold cause and effect method, we really begin by contemplating the benefit that others have done to us or for us. And so we're thinking from that kind of perspective of, well, I should benefit these beings because they have benefited me. Well, when it comes to the exchange of self and other, we really are doing this on the basis of recognizing the equality of our desire to have happiness and to not suffer with that of every other sentient being. So as Shantideva says, strive at first to meditate upon the sameness of yourself and others. In joy and sorrow all are equal, thus be the guardian of all as of yourself. So here we begin in this method of equalizing and exchanging self and other, of recognizing that every sentient being has this desire to have happiness and a desire not to have to suffer. We are exactly the same in this way. Now normally we sort of think about our own desires. We think about our own wish for happiness and our own desire not to suffer, and we kind of are indifferent to the desires of others. We sort of think of them almost like inanimate objects. Whatever happens to them may happen, it doesn't really affect me. And so we need to get away from that kind of feeling and develop a sense of feeling that others have that exact same desire, the wish not to have to suffer and the want to have happiness. And so in this way, we recognize that we want to help others. So not only these others that are sort of symbolized by our mothers and fathers, but all sentient beings who have acted in that capacity, we should want to help them in accomplishing their aims, help them in this desire not to suffer and the wish to have happiness. So we shouldn't just sort of have this thought of, well, whatever happens, happens, but actually try to help beings accomplish their happiness and help beings eliminate their sufferings. So as we recognize that our desire for happiness and desire not to suffer is exactly the same as all other sentient beings. As it says here, in joy and sorrow all are equal. Thus be the guardian of all as of yourself. So in the way that we normally look out for ourselves, protect ourselves, want to accomplish our aims, so too we should act towards others as their desire is exactly the same. So up until now, we have held ourselves, this I, as most important. We think about ourselves and really have this kind of self-cherishing attitude, this self-importance, and we dismiss others. So throughout the beginningless rebirths that we have taken, we have been pursuing this kind of aim of accomplishing our aims by holding ourselves as most important, by engaging in this kind of self-cherishing attitude. But really, all of our faults are coming from holding ourselves as most important in that way. We have been working to accomplish our own aims, but yet we are still here in samsara. We are still subject to cyclic existence. And so that kind of pursuit of our own aims through that self-cherishing attitude has not really gotten us anywhere. This is something that we need to change then. We need to exchange the normal way in which we cherish ourselves and hold ourselves as more important. We need to exchange that for holding others as important. And instead of sort of casting aside, not thinking of or dismissing others, we should do that with ourselves. Because again, we have sort of taken, if we look at where we have gotten since beginningless time, holding ourselves as more important and cherishing ourselves, we are still subject to the sufferings of samsara. And so we need to switch this way of thinking. Instead of holding ourselves as most important and trying to pursue our own aims, we should instead try to strive to work for the benefit of others. And in the way that we normally cast aside the needs of others, we should do so with a sort of self-cherishing attitude. And again, this is something that Shantideva describes as being kind of a practice which is done in secret. We aren't really proclaiming that we are doing this exchange of our self-cherishing for cherishing others in a way that we tell everybody in the world. This is something that is kind of against the way that things are normally done in the world. And the Buddha actually gave the Mahayana teachings in secret. He didn't give them to everybody. He taught the Dharma of the Four Noble Truths and that of the sort of being of small capacity and middling capacity in general. But this sort of, especially the practice of exchanging self and others, is really only for certain disciples. So as the Kadampa masters have explained again, we have, since beginningless time, had this self-cherishing attitude, but it never has gotten us to accomplish any of our aims. So rather than that, maybe change this kind of attitude and instead develop this self-cherishing attitude, which is the source of all good qualities. So here, there are two kind of main obstacles to us embracing this kind of exchange of self and other, exchanging our self-cherishing attitude and our kind of casting away of others for an embrace of this attitude which cherishes others and kind of dismisses ourself. So one of the main obstacles is holding this self, this I, as being like autonomously established, as not being dependent or contingent upon anything else, being set up from its own side. So in the way that we look at this I or this me, the self, and then we think about others, both of those appear to have some kind of like real existence from their own side, have some sort of autonomy, whereas really these things are contingently designated. So when we have like this mountain here and that mountain over there, those things are always relative. If you are the one standing here, then that mountain is over there. But for the person on that mountain, that is the here for them. And so too it is with our sort of attitude about a self. For every single being, they each have an individual sense of I, this sense of self. And we hold that self to be important, whereas others are kind of insignificant. And so when we look at it from our perspective, we hold ourself as being important and others as insignificant. But from their perspective, their self is important and others are insignificant. And it all really depends upon where we are looking from, our way of thinking. It's not something like blue and yellow, where those are blue and yellow regardless of what else there is. Here, this is something which is contingent, where we have like this and that, here and there. And that is the way that we look at the self and other. And so in this way, we kind of think of ourself as being distinct from others, set up from its own side, and really this I, without having to depend upon others or in any way be designated contingent upon anything. And along with that, we then think, oh, this is my happiness and my suffering, and that is their happiness and their suffering. There's sort of no connection between those things. We think of them as being like distinct and separate, theirs and ours. But really, once we begin to break that down, we can then exchange these kinds of attitudes and sequentially over time develop such that we get rid of our self-cherishing attitude and develop an attitude of cherishing others. So likewise, as it is said in the Guru Puja, there is a verse which says that this chronic disease of cherishing ourselves is the cause giving rise to our unsought suffering. Perceiving this, we seek your blessings to blame, begrudge, and destroy the monstrous demon of selfishness. So here, this kind of self-cherishing attitude is like a chronic disease that we have. It has been with us since beginningless rebirths, and we hold ourselves to be most important, whether it is like thinking about our ourself and our country, our place. We have this strong self-cherishing attitude, and it keeps us from being able to really do any great real benefit for other sentient beings. This attitude of thinking mine and having this strong self-cherishing only causes harm. It only acts as a kind of hindrance to being able to benefit others. And it's also, as it says here, the cause giving rise to our unsought suffering. So we need to recognize that although we think we are benefiting ourselves with this cherishing, we're actually acting in a way that just causes harm. Since beginningless time, we have been taking rebirth, and we have been holding this kind of I as super important, as extra important, and working for that benefit. But yet, here we are, still cycling within samsara. And so we recognize that this is really the source of our problems. As it says, perceiving this, we seek your blessings to blame, begrudge, and destroy this monstrous demon of selfishness. Recognizing that this self-cherishing attitude is really what has hindered us. We think, well, if it weren't for this, I could already be a Buddha. I could be high up on the Bodhisattva paths if I had gotten rid of this. And so this, where we say like begrudge it, it's really recognizing that this is the source of our faults. This is something that is not good, and we're not going to let it increase anymore. We see the fault in this kind of attitude. Now, self-cherishing is not something that we can just poof, get rid of all in one instance, but sequentially, slowly, over time, we can reduce the force and finally extricate ourselves from this kind of attitude that really acts as the source of all of our suffering. So here, then it continues saying that, in brief, infantile beings labor only for their own end, while Buddhas work solely for the welfare of others. With a mind understanding the distinctions between the failings of one and the advantages of the other, we seek your blessings to enable us to equalize and exchange ourselves and others. So here, it's really, and also in Shantideva's text, he says, well, what need is there for any kind of lengthy explanation here? Us childish beings, those of us who are pursuing our kind of self-cherishing attitude, we look out for ourselves, but look where we are. We're still cycling in samsara. Whereas Buddhas labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them. We could be progressing on the path. We could be making that kind of progress, but it's really our self-cherishing attitude that holds us back. There's no need to say a lot about this. Us sort of infantile beings are working for ourselves, but not really getting anywhere. Whereas Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, working for the benefit of others with this self-cherishing attitude, they develop these qualities. So here we should exchange this kind of attitude of holding ourselves, cherishing ourselves as most important, and instead develop a kind of attitude of cherishing others, become like a servant for others, working for the benefit of others. So here we shouldn't kind of become despondent at this or become depressed at this, but recognize, well, we can decide to continue with our self-cherishing attitude and allow that to take us to the lower realms, go to the become a hell being or a hungry ghost and so forth. Or we can change that. We can exchange our self-cherishing for an attitude that really cherishes others, and in that way develop good qualities. So this is the kind of sort of a question that we have for ourselves. So here then, in developing bodhicitta through the kind of mind training of exchanging self and other, again, exchanging this self-cherishing attitude for an attitude of cherishing others, we don't really focus on or contemplate as much the kind of connection that we have with others in terms of their having benefited us in the past, their having acted as, say, our mothers, and how they have helped us and so forth. So here, if we think about the kind of way of training the mind in the sevenfold cause and effect, one is thinking of all sentient beings as having been one's mother and recalling their kindness and the wish to repay that kindness. But here, this is kind of an understanding that is really based upon just recognizing that we are equal to others in the desire to have happiness and the desire not to suffer. And we can see that sometimes this kind of attitude naturally will arise for us. We have a wish to benefit another being. We see them suffering, say, and we want to help alleviate their suffering without any sort of thought of, oh, they benefited me in the past, or they're my friend or relative. We can see that sometimes this kind of attitude arises where we really just recognize that the other being is a person who experiences this desire to have happiness and a desire not to suffer. And so without contemplating the previous kindness, without thinking about the sort of relationship to you, it's something where we really are recognizing that that other being just wants to have happiness and doesn't want to suffer for their own sort of a benefit. So here, again, when we're doing the sevenfold cause and effect method, it's really contemplating that kindness that was shown to you. And this wish to attain Buddhahood comes out of the desire to repay that kindness. But this is really something wherein the equalizing and exchanging of self and others, it's really not just about contemplating their kindness toward you, but just recognizing that fundamental sort of basic thought that we all have. So again, this is something where was not necessarily taught to everybody. In Shantideva's text, it's referred to as sort of like the sacred secret or sacred mystery. It's something wherein we don't expect everybody to be able to do this immediately. In Buddhism, we talk about the sort of teachings for the being of small capacity and the being of middling capacity, and then get into that of the being of great capacity. But we should do what we are able to do. We actually need to do what accords with our abilities. Now, in the past, it was the case that we wouldn't really have taught the Mahayana teachings widely because they were really taught specifically for those disciples who were ready, who were good receptacles for those teachings. And so here, I mean, if we were to go out in the world and try to tell everybody, don't think of yourself, you need to think of others, they would think you're crazy, really, to just think of others only above yourself. So, I mean, these days, the tradition has kind of changed, wherein teachers give all kinds of teachings, all of the various levels of Tantra and the Mahayana teachings and so forth, with this sort of attitude that at least they're putting down imprints. Now, there's sometimes the danger of disciples giving rise to wrong views regarding these teachings, but sometimes that's sort of dismissed in that, well, these imprints will allow someone to be able to realize that in the future, even if they have some sort of wrong view now. But here, no matter what kind of teachings we hear, if we are not yet able to practice it ourselves, we should still try to think, you know, that's an impressive sort of teaching. That's something that I hope to be able to do in the future, even recognizing if it's something that we can't do now. So we should try not to have any kind of wrong view, saying like, oh, that's impossible or something like that, but recognize that there are some things that maybe are not in our capacity yet. When we talk about a bodhisattva, the actual term in the Tibetan involves this syllable that means hero. And usually when we talk about a hero, we're talking about somebody that's saying maybe very courageous in battle and kills lots of people. But that's not a real hero. A real hero is a bodhisattva, the one with this kind of skill in means to be able to lead others. And so recognizing that maybe we're not yet at that point where we can train in all of those things, we should appreciate the kind of imprints that they lay down, but also try not to give rise to wrong view regarding those sorts of teachings. A real hero, you know, a bodhisattva, it takes a lot to become that. The sort of a worldly hero, as Shantideva says, is just killing the dead. That's not really someone we should look up to. So here, as it says in the first chapter of the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Shantideva says that he gives this example, really, that's sort of a very vivid example, saying that just as on a dark night black with clouds, the sudden lightning glares and all is clearly shown, Likewise, rarely, through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts rise, brief and transient in the world. And so if we can imagine like a really dark night where there's lots of cloud cover, it's very sort of like this thick darkness, maybe raining some, and this kind of represents our ordinary way of acting in the world. Our speech, our sort of comportment of ourselves tends to be pretty much non-virtuous. Our ordinary way of acting is strongly non-virtuous. And so whether we're speaking or whatever it is, that sort of tends to be our normal pattern. Well, like a flash of lightning on that in that dark night where everything is illuminated for just a moment. It says, likewise, rarely, through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts arise. And so in the way that, like, on a really dark and stormy night, we have a flash of lightning that illuminates the whole, say, area for just a moment, just a brief transient second. This is like due to the imprints of the Buddha, of having heard the teachings in previous lives and so forth. We have these imprints of virtue that can, from time to time, arise, very sort of seldom, and are much weaker in relation to our kind of non-virtuous thoughts. So generally, we tend to be a lot weaker in our virtue. We're much more habituated to non-virtue. And it's really, again, like this sort of dark and long night, most of our time is spent in non-virtue. In countless rebirths, we have sort of been acting in this way and creating the kinds of negative actions that will lead to ripening births in the hells and so forth. And so as it continues into the next verse, Shantideva says, well, virtue thus is weak, and always evil is of great and overwhelming strength. That's our sort of normal course of things. Except for perfect bodhicitta, what other virtue is there that can lay it low? So if we need a method for dealing with this kind of situation in which we are very much overpowered by our non-virtues, and our virtue is very weak, it's very sort of sporadic and less powerful, the most efficacious kind of method that we can use is developing this attitude of bodhicitta. It's the most powerful kind of positive, virtuous thought that is able to oppress or overcome that kind of great non-virtue, the store of non-virtue. So except for this attitude of bodhicitta, there's nothing really powerful enough to purify those negativities that we've accumulated in countless previous lives. So here, then, the most powerful kind of supreme method for purifying our negativities is this attitude of bodhicitta, love and compassion. So continuing with the next verse, it says, for many eons, deeply pondering, the mighty sages saw its benefits, the benefits of bodhicitta, whereby unnumbered multitudes are brought with ease to supreme joy. So here, those who have gained supreme enlightenment have contemplated and have through their intelligence determined that this attitude of bodhicitta is the most powerful kind of method for purifying our negativities and also for bringing others to this state of supreme joy. There's nothing superior to that. So here, again, this is something where we aren't able to give rise to this immediately, but rather in stages we can, over time, generate this kind of attitude. So if we want to bring benefit, supreme benefit to sentient beings, this is really bringing them liberation and the state of omniscience. This sort of attitude is something that brings about that benefit, both for ourselves and others. And one is able to do this in a way where you aren't sort of subject to suffering, subject to austerities to be able to get to that point, but rather bodhisattvas travel the path going from joy to joy. So when we are engaged in our non-virtuous kinds of attitudes, we have these negative minds, we have these things that create suffering. But bodhisattvas really are developing good minds, developing positive minds in such a way that working for the benefit of beings is something that they take on willingly and joyfully. And so it's actually, as it says here, whereby unnumbered multitudes are brought with ease to supreme joy. So although, yes, we need to make effort at it, it's not like something wherein we are subjecting ourselves to terrible austerities, but rather it is a joyful kind of a path. So here, should bodhicitta come to birth in those who suffer, chained in prisons of samsara, in that instant they are called the children of the blissful one, revered by all the world, by gods and humankind. So when one gives rise to bodhicitta, and first we have this kind of aspirational bodhicitta, wherein we aspire to gain the state of Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. And then there is the aspirational bodhicitta, where we're engaged in the trainings necessary to do that. Someone like us, an ordinary being like us, who suffers, chained in the prisons of cyclic existence, if we are able to, by developing attitudes of compassion and love over a long time, training in those, if we are able to give rise to this kind of attitude of bodhicitta, then at that moment we are called children of the conquerors, or children of the Buddhas, and revered by all the world, by gods and humankind. So here, us as ordinary beings, we are in our ordinary lives kind of creating bad karma, and due to that karma we are then going to have to take rebirth, and there's no sort of certainty about that rebirth, as we are driven by our various afflictions and our karma. And so once we recognize this kind of situation of being in this prison of samsara and have generated this attitude of bodhicitta, in that instant, in that moment, one becomes like a child of the Buddha, like an heir to the Buddha. So we refer often to the Buddha as being like a victor or a king. And it is one who was following after in that same path by generating this attitude of bodhicitta that we refer to as a child of the victor. Someone who will eventually sort of take on that role of embodying the state of Buddhahood, wherein one has removed all faults and developed all good qualities. And so upon generating this attitude in a kind of unfabricated way, we gain this sort of special name, this special title. This is also listed in the kind of benefits of bodhicitta in the Lam Rim, wherein one is referred to as being like an heir or a child of the Buddhas. And not only that, but one is like this real kind of hero, not just a sort of hero in the sense of being able to kill others, but a hero with the kind of special skills that are respected by others. So here, upon gaining such a special name, one takes up a position of being revered by all of the sort of worldly deities. They see you as being worthy of worship, Brahma and Indra and so forth, because you have this kind of strength of mind, this determination to benefit other sentient beings that is beyond their capacity. And so this, again, although describing sort of the kind of transformation that comes when one generates bodhicitta in an unfabricated, uncontrived kind of way, this is something that we should recognize is done by beings who are like us. If we begin training the mind in love and compassion, we are able to eventually generate bodhicitta, first in a kind of fabricated way, and then in an uncontrived kind of manner, becoming one who is like a child of the victors and so forth. And so this is, again, stressing the importance, the need of laying down these imprints, of really training the mind in love and compassion in order to gain these incredible benefits of bodhicitta. So then this next verse describes bodhicitta as like the supreme substance of the alchemists. It takes our impure flesh and makes it the body of a Buddha, jewel beyond all price. Such is bodhicitta. Let us grasp it firmly. So we have this ordinary body of flesh and blood with all of our various organs, and sort of it's in the nature of being unclean, with our lungs and our liver and all of these things. And it's subject to destruction. This body body is such that it is going to disintegrate. It's momentarily disintegrating. And as opposed to that, when we are able to generate this attitude of bodhicitta such that we attain the state of Buddhahood, we gain this body that is in the nature of light, that is not like our ordinary impure, unclean body. And so here, again, it's encouraging us to make effort at generating this attitude of bodhicitta in order to be able to gain such a state, the body of a Buddha, a jewel beyond all price. And so here, this is the kind of nature of bodhicitta, and recognizing its benefits, we should thus give rise to this attitude if we have not yet given rise to it, and we should make our effort to protect the bodhicitta that we have generated so far. And in a following verse, it describes, Shantideva describes bodhicitta like a kind of sort of wish-fulfilling tree, in that all other virtues, like the plantain tree, produce their fruit, but then their force is spent. Alone, the marvelous tree of bodhicitta constantly bears fruit and grows unceasingly. So if we engage in virtuous actions, all of our virtues that are done without being held by this attitude of bodhicitta in our motivation and in our dedication, those virtues will bring about a ripening result. But that's sort of it. They exhaust themselves with that ripening result. Whereas if we are to infuse our virtues with an attitude of bodhicitta, and especially to dedicate them toward the enlightenment of all sentient beings, then there is no kind of exhaustion of the ripening results of those virtues. So in the case of a virtue done without bodhicitta, one may say engage in generosity, and then the sort of results of that generosity will ripen, but then that virtue is exhausted, it's gone, it's all done. Whereas if we have this attitude of bodhicitta, if we really, whatever virtue we do on a regular basis, whether it's some kind of generosity or anything else, if we dedicate that toward the great enlightenment of all sentient beings, then there is no sort of exhaustion of that virtue. If we do all of the kind of positive actions that we do on a daily basis, if we think that we are doing them for the benefit of all sentient beings, for their ultimate enlightenment, then we are going to enjoy the fruits on a regular basis, the sort of ripening results of those virtues. But our virtues will also be continuously increasing, like this marvelous tree of bodhicitta that constantly bears fruit and grows unceasingly. When we dedicate our virtues toward great enlightenment, then no matter how much we sort of enjoy on a daily basis in terms of the fruits of our virtues, there's no exhaustion to that. All that we have done will continue to increase more and more. So here, continuing with the benefits of bodhicitta, it says then, Shantideva says, as though they pass through perils, guarded by a hero, even those weighed down with dreadful wickedness will instantly be freed through having bodhicitta. Why do those who fear their sins not have recourse to it? So here, those who are weighted down by great kind of non-virtues, great negativities, those that have been committed in relation to, say, the three jewels, in relation to one's guru, in relation to one's parents, and so forth, those kinds of great negativities, even those who are weighed down by that, or who have committed such actions in the past, they will be freed instantly through giving rise to this attitude of bodhicitta. As someone who is, say, like going along a path with many perils, many, say, robbers and thieves and so forth that one needs to watch out for, who is guarded by a hero, they're able to sort of safely pass through those dangers. Even one who has been weighted down with these kinds of negativities, even very great negativities in relation to various objects, if one gives rise to bodhicitta, one will be instantly freed from that kind of danger, the danger of the ripening effects of those negativities that one has previously accumulated. So those who have a kind of fear, who are in fear of the negativity that they have accumulated in the past, why would they not have recourse to it? Or why would they not then rely upon bodhicitta that has such a power to free us from our negativities? So here then, For when, and again, this is when one has taken up this kind of attitude of bodhicitta, given rise first to a kind of aspirational bodhicitta, wishing to attain this state of Buddhahood in which one has eliminated all faults and gained all good qualities. One first has this thought of, I want to attain that. And then there's the kind of active bodhicitta engaging with the various trainings in order to actually achieve that goal. So one takes up bodhicitta through a kind of vow. And here, Shantideva's couple of verses describe the kind of benefits that come when one takes up such an attitude in a kind of unfabricated, uncontrived way. So it says then, for when, with irreversible intent, the mind embraces bodhicitta, willing to set free the endless multitude of beings, in that instant, from that moment on, a great and unremitting stream, a strength of wholesome merit, even during sleep and inattention, rises equal to the vastness of the sky. So here, when one has given rise to this kind of attitude of bodhicitta, we should recognize the kind of incredible benefits that come from such an uncontrived attitude of bodhicitta. So here, we might have like a danger of thinking, you know, I don't know if I could give rise to such an attitude, or if I could hold on to it for all time. But really, if we are able to generate such a strong and kind of uncontrived attitude of bodhicitta, then it's such that it's like continuously working, no matter what we might be doing, whether we are sleeping, whether we are drunk, Geshe says, whether we are sort of playing around. This kind of attitude of bodhicitta remains, infuses all of our attitudes. So if we have really genuinely developed this kind of wish to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings, then really all of our actions go toward that. So whether we are eating, taking care of ourselves, supporting this kind of body that is working, or this sort of basis working toward that goal, whatever we do then goes toward that kind of virtue. So whether we're eating, whether we're sleeping, whether we're playing, whether we're getting drunk, that kind of bodhicitta attitude continues. And so here, when we think about the sort of joy that that brings forth, the kind of bliss and pleasure really that come from having this genuine attitude of bodhicitta, it really, if we look at the kind of happiness that comes from an arhat that is, say, on one of the lesser paths, that is striving for their own individual liberation, that kind of liberation that they achieve, obviously there's a great deal of happiness in that, but it really pales in comparison to the kind of bliss and joy experienced by a bodhisattva who has this vast attitude and is working toward that. And again, this is something where when one has bodhicitta, one has this level of mental fortitude, of mental strength, such that there isn't difficulty in engaging or undertaking these deeds to benefit others. So we need, in this way, to be kind of like have a far-sighted, be more long-term in our thinking, be more far-sighted. We are not just talking about this life and kind of making effort in this one life, but we're talking about lifetime after lifetime working for the benefit of sentient beings until we get to that point of Buddhahood. And so all of the kind of trainings that we are engaging in now, love and compassion and generosity and so forth, when one is really infused with a bodhicitta attitude, one is neither in a hurry to get to that goal, nor does one feel any sort of difficulty in engaging in those virtues. It is joyful to engage in that kind of effort. And so this is important for those of us who are not, where we haven't yet given rise to bodhicitta. We really need to be careful to be sort of balanced in our effort toward things. We can't be too intense and sort of like be really working really hard and then get tired of something. We need to have the right sort of effort. It's always described that our practice should be like a stream, like a river, where it's flowing really evenly and continuously. So we don't want to be sort of like make too much effort and then give up too much, but rather like a stream, we should have this constant flow of effort. And when we eventually give rise to bodhicitta in this uncontrived way, then that will really carry all of our efforts in that stream of virtue toward Buddhahood. So when we first begin, it is difficult. It does take effort to try to work on our minds, to change and transform our minds. But we shouldn't sort of give up thinking like, oh, this is too difficult, I'm not going to try. But rather, as Shantideva has said, that there's nothing that doesn't transform through habituation. If we habituate ourselves to something, if we familiarize ourselves, then we can really change. From, say, when we had like an enemy whose name we couldn't bear to hear, suddenly we're unhappy if we are away from that person. So this is the nature of our mind. It isn't permanent, it isn't static, but rather we have the ability to transform our minds through our way of thinking. Like we can have an enemy whose name we can't bear to hear, but through habituation, through getting to know them and finally becoming friends with them, we really are unhappy if they are apart from us. So we can see how easy it is for our mind to be transformed. So something that begins as difficult will, through familiarization, become easy. So here, from this collected sayings of the Kadampa masters, there is a saying by the Kadam master Chengawa, where he says that we, in order to strive for liberation and omniscience, we need minds that don't accord with the world, the sort of worldly attitudes that we normally have. And so even normally in the world, we sort of look at other sentient beings with a kind of contempt or dismissiveness and cherish Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But really, there's no better way to go for refuge than by benefiting other sentient beings. There's no higher way to make Buddhas happy than to actually benefit sentient beings. So, like, if we have, for example, a mother and her child is suffering, and her child manages to get out of that suffering somehow, that mother is going to be happy. It's not going to be like, oh, well, why didn't you ask me for help? There's a sort of recognition that the best kind of refuge that we can take is by benefiting other sentient beings. And in the way that this is pleasing to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, this requires us to see things differently. Buddhas and Bodhisattvas work exclusively for the benefit of others. They have overcome the kind of normal way that we as ordinary beings look at others, where we sort of look at others as being kind of those that we are going to fight with, or those that might be a foil to our plans, and so forth. Instead, they see sentient beings as this sort of wanting for them to have happiness and wishing to benefit them. So here, when it comes to our own practice of going for refuge and wanting to engage in these trainings, we have to get over the normal ways that we are sort of treating other sentient beings with contempt, while simultaneously then, say, turning to the Buddhas and showing them a great deal of respect. We can't actually show respect for the Buddhas while we are simultaneously showing contempt for sentient beings, who are their highest object of good, that they want to benefit the most. And so the best way to then go for refuge is through our benefit to other beings. And so, again, this isn't something where we are necessarily able to generate this attitude all at once, but rather we need to have respect for those kinds of instructions and trainings that we are not yet able to do. We may not yet be able to exchange our kind of self-cherishing attitude completely for an attitude of cherishing others, but seeing the benefit of that, having respect for those kinds of practices, are the way that we will eventually be able to engage in them. So in this way, we should recognize the importance of not just sort of having respect for Buddhas because they're sort of high up objects, but actually having respect for all sentient beings and working for their benefit, as that is really how we come to embody Buddhahood eventually. So there's a story about Atisha who had in his sort of entourage, the group around him, one person who was particularly sort of ill-behaved, and others in his retinue said, you know, you really should get rid of that guy. I don't know why you keep him around. And Atisha said, well, you may find him quite annoying, but he's actually a great great practice for my patients. And so here we have many beings that will benefit us in the world, but those that cause us harm are especially important for times to practice, for opportunities for us to practice patience and be able to eventually work for the benefit of all sentient beings, regardless of how they have treated us. So again, this is something that won't come instantly, but through training our minds, we can eventually get to that point. So then the earlier Kadam masters stressed the importance of meditating on love and compassion, on bodhicitta, and having this correct view of emptiness and renunciation. But all of those needed to be present in order for our virtues to go toward liberation and to the state of omniscience. So it is said that it's kind of like we all have a deity to meditate on and we all have a mantra to say, but no one's really engaging in these practices. As Je Lama Tsongkhapa says in the Foundation of All Good Qualities, having trained in the common paths, may I bless me to enter this mantrayana. So even if we are meditating on a deity and reciting mantras and so forth, we all seem to have these practices to do. If we are missing the components of having renunciation and bodhicitta and the correct view, they're really not going toward a practice of Dharma. So here we should recognize really just the importance of having these attitudes. Particularly here we're talking about love and compassion and bodhicitta. And we can recognize the power of love and compassion even outside of any kind of religious system. Whether someone is religious or not, as His Holiness often says, love and compassion are necessary kind of components. And so someone who maybe doesn't accept their future lives, even if that is the case, that they don't have that kind of view, they're not going to lose anything by, say, practicing love and compassion in this life. They only are going to profit from that. So in society, in our world, we need these attitudes of love and compassion. And whether we are doing so on a basis of some kind of religious attitude based upon future lives, or just doing so recognizing the kind of benefits even within one life, this is something that we all need. So here I have taken the time to sort of go a little bit aside from the text to talk about this equalizing and exchanging of self and other in the context of developing bodhicitta in order to sort of add to the explanation. And so we didn't get back to the text this time, but next time we will turn back to the text because I think we're out of time for today.